Okay, this is the debut episode of a feature called Thorin versus Loco. And pretty self explanatory concept. I'm Thorin, that's Loco. We have versus each other on a topic. Let's see if there ever is more than one episode, but we'll start off because this is Loco's idea of a concept, right? It's a pretty good concept overall because you don't see a lot of actual, like, okay, so there's discussions on talk shows, right? But oftentimes it's actually hard to get people who disagree with each other, And if they do disagree with each other, they won't really have like a proper head to head on it, Like one person will say one thing and then the other person could make his own point, and they never really like, there's not really like a connection between them and a back and forth. So Loco has an area where he disagrees with me, and it goes like this. Every year, the topic comes up after Worlds. Is the gap closing? We've all heard this, like the way it's phrased, the gap is closing, or people say it's in mockingly, as I did, like the gap is closing, and then he kind of cites some stat that you think shows that, like, well, obviously the gap is bigger or whatever. So Loco, how do you start the premise off? Why does Loco say the gap between the best Korean teams and the best? By the way, I assume you accept that premise, right? It's the best Koreans and the best Westerners. It's not like the entire tier of Korea and all of the West, right?
Well, I don't want to just look at tip top versus tip top. I
Okay.
think we should look at it overall, reason versus reason. But I think
Right.
every year, gap is closing slowly.
Okay, so give me what would the big headline reason be as to why for you?
So if you look at way far back, let's say competitive League of Legends, say begins at season 2. Okay,
Sure.
because season 1 is there's no Koreans. It's almost like a beta phase for the professional scene. So I think going off of season 1 is like, it's
Yeah.
very.
I mean, there's
Yeah.
no server in Korea, so there's no reason to count that area anyway. In this discussion, at least, right?
So in season 2, if you look at overall the top Azubu teams and the top Najin teams, Frostblades, Najin Sword, Najin Shield, versus the top NA teams, actually gap was slightly smaller back then due to Koreans not being in full, let's say, like Korean mode, and then they kicked it in where they got their system down, they got
Sure.
their player farm system down. So that's like Koreans kicking in the system. So the gap was actually pretty small.
I mean, the
But
fair
even
way
the-
to say that, by the way, would be like it wasn't really till 2013 that you got like all the Kesper teams were in.
Yeah. So if you start looking from 2013, you look at SKT. That's the Omega Korean team, right?
Sure.
The strongest of the strongest. It'd be like SKT, Blaze. It'd be Sword. It'd be White.
Bullets.
KT Bullets. These teams were so strong comparatively to now. Like if you look at SKT now versus SKT then, I genuinely believe all 5 players, Impact, Faker, Piglet, Mandu, Bengi, were the best players in their roles in the world. And the laning gap between Koreans and the non-Korean was crazy far. And the laning gap really, really close in terms of individual mechanics. When you have imports coming in and you play versus those imports, your laning mechanic goes up. Also, people started researching Koreans more, respecting Koreans more. They started watching Korean bots. They started bootcamping in Korean. So they started picking up things from Korea.
Sure.
But so individual laning mechanics
Yeah.
definitely close as a gap due to imports and people bootcamping in Korea, and also just people respecting and researching Koreans. And the top Korean teams nowadays versus then aren't as completed and aren't as perfect. If you look at Wolf in SKT, I would rate him maybe top 3, top 4 support in the world,
Sure.
and he's on the best Korean team. That would never happen like back then. Like you would have to be the best of the best, or like your team is like really unique and you bring something really unique to the table, so that's why you're there. But in terms of like Korean teams back then and Korean teams now, they're definitely weaker. So I do think in terms of mechanics, the gap closed a lot. And then now the biggest gap is in macro and in team fighting. And I think West is investing more and more into coaching staff. If you look at, so what's ridiculous to me is like people make statements about Korean coaching staff. People make statements regarding Korean Kespa teams, but they have no idea like how they operate. They say stuff like, "Oh, Korean Kespa teams are so hard to beat. They practice this much hours. They do this. They do that. They've been doing this. They have so much coaching staff." Do you actually know what a Korean coaching staff looks like? Do you actually know like how a Korean team operates?
Sure.
Until last year, SKT had 2 people on the coaching staff. One person, the head coach, oh my god, the name's slipping my mind right now,
Koma?
but he used, no, not Koma.
Oh, the head of SK. You mean the guy who was the StarCraft guy as well? Like,
No, he wasn't the StarCraft guy. He was a Special Force guy.
right.
He came
okay.
from Special Force.
Okay.
And he basically all his job is to give the team the SKT flavor. It's like, okay, come on, this is how we do things in SKG. This is how we treat players. This is how we discipline players. This is how we do things with players. His game knowledge was at like a gold level when he first started out, and then yeah, they stayed with 2 people coaching staff for like the entirety until they picked up Mandu. And Koreans don't even have analysts. Koreans don't have sports psych. West, maybe not in terms of money, but I'm pretty sure in terms of money also, invest way more into coaching staff. Like a typical Western coaching staff is like a head coach, strategy coach, sports psych, 2 to 3 analysts. So the infrastructure and the structure for Western teams is actually getting better than Koreans. And I think by the end of next year, it should be like completely fully better. People should have all developed a system in terms of how they use everyone.
Okay.
So
right, was the guy you were referring to, by the way, that guy whose alias is like Lies? Lies. Was it that guy?
Pyonghun? He should be Pyonghun.
Yeah, Byung-hoon Choi.
Yeah,
Okay,
Choi
right.
Byung-hun.
Just checking that I know who you're talking about here. Good. But the idea, by the way, for people who don't know in the West, is actually, this is quite famous in even StarCraft teams, is like the guy who's the head coach isn't usually the guy who's like the strategy guy, you know. He's the guy where his job is set the tone, you know, he's like the ultimate authority figure, you have to practice this much, and then there's people below them, like actually Koma is below this guy, and he is the strategy coach, you know, he tells them what they will pick and ban and what they will do specifically in a practice, right?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous how people make out Korean coaching staff and like the Korean history to give them such a lead, but that's complete bullshit. Because first of all, most of you guys have never played on a Korean team. First of all, or second of all, you guys don't know how KESPA teams operate.
Sure.
So it's like whenever people say there's such a huge gap due to how Korean coaching staff and structure works, I just find it funny. Like you're speaking out of your ass.
Okay, right. Well, you gave me a lot there. You peppered me with loads of stuff there. So let's narrow it down to some specific areas, right?
Okay.
So basically, as far as I can tell, your premise was, in the early days, Koreans were the best because they had mechanical advantage. They had, they have sister teams, but that's like a side issue, you know, like sister teams to some degree. And then also because people didn't know how to research them and hadn't actually boot camped them. So for example, boot camp is like not the same as research, it's like you haven't had exposure to them. You only play them once at Worlds, for example, you know. So those are like the big reasons back in the first couple of years of Korea versus the West why they were ahead, right?
And also they didn't respect Koreans. They thought Koreans were garbage.
Sure, that's like the first year then, yeah, sure, okay. Right, well in that case, if those gaps have eroded, that means the overall gap for Loco between Korea and the West has eroded as well.
It's definitely
so. For example,
closed
you would say that the West mechanically the gap is closed. Let's go on that one first. Mechanically, the gap is closed between the West and Korea.
Definitely, in terms of laning, for the top tier Western players versus top tier Korean players, the gap has closed a lot.
Okay. See, when you say that, Loco, then I think of like some good Western players, and we still saw many of them in matchups at Worlds losing in lane.
Some people got smashed.
Why is that though?
Well, it's not like the gap closed completely. So say like if you play League of Legends perfectly, it's 100, okay, in laning. Back then, say Korea was like a 70, and rest of the world averaged at like a 30. Now Korea's at like a 85, and rest of the world is at like a 70. So the gap definitely closed. Like Koreans got better, but NA and EU and China and all the regions caught up a lot.
Okay. So on this angle alone, right? Here's one of the issues, right? When you say that, here's my premise, okay? I'll give you my like big marquee premise, and then there's obviously details as to how you can get into that. So this will sound really weird, because it'll sound like I'm trying to cheat, Loco. It'll sound like I'm trying to have it both ways. But there is a logic to it if you listen to it, okay? So the problem with if I say the gap hasn't closed is people will think that means I think it either got bigger or that West didn't get better, which is definitely not. I don't think anyone could say that the West didn't get better. Okay, that's not the case. But I mean it like this. Okay, if you imagine that we had a scale, and it's not a scale out of 10. Okay, but on the scale, Koreans are 10 points in whatever era they were the biggest gap. Okay, and let's say the best Western teams. So we're talking about like, you know, in the past it would be like Fnatic or something like this, you know, whoever it might be. Let's say back in the day, 2 or 3 years ago, they were like pretty good, you know, but they weren't as good as the best Koreans. So let's say Koreans are 10 and the top Western teams were 8. So there's still a sizable gap. They're going to lose most of the time. But you know what? Like, as you might have seen, they'd have the odd game where they'd look really good or they'd come close, and you'd be like, oh, great. So in that scenario, the gap in terms of like an actual overall number, like a real number, is 2 in my system, okay? So there's a gap of 2. So now imagine, because League of Legends has moved on and the game's gotten more and more factors that are considered and everyone has more things coaching, they've practiced, people have had long careers where they've played 3 or 4 worlds. Now let's imagine that the Koreans are at number 30, right? They're all the way at 30.
So in your, what is it? Is it 30 out of 30 or 10 out of 10?
Just 30. That's whatever the maximum. I'm trying to make it so it's like an objective amount, so everyone's moving forwards in the world.
So right? The game got more complex, in your opinion? So like if the game used to cap out at a 10, now it's at a 30?
It's not that it capped at a 10, it's just that that's the level, okay? That was the highest level, was 10 in this world. It's not a percentage scale, okay? It's just an overall one. So the idea is everyone's moved forward. So everyone's past 10 now, for example, because for example, TSM this year, if you took them back in a time machine, I bet they probably could beat SK Telecom because they would understand things about the game and even how to prepare for people that SK Telecom wouldn't. So, okay, in this world, here's the key detail. So now I've put Koreans at a 30, and what's great is I've got Westerners are actually still behind Loco. I've still got them at 25. They're still 5 behind. So they're pretty good, you know. They've got a lot of things. Now, the thing here is, in terms of gap, the gap on one level, on the relative level, is actually closing, because now the gap has gone from 80% up to 83% for the West. But in terms of actual real number, it's now 5 gap instead of 2. So do you see what I did there? It sounds like I'm cheating, but I'm not.
I think your logic's not great.
Okay, come on, hit me with it.
The game gets reset in a lot of ways. A lot of the big concepts stay, and the big concepts that are staying, the Western teams are able to master. So one thing.
Tell me a single concept that a Western team has mastered.
Okay, so, I mean, this is a very basic one, and this is from experience. So, the way that White wave control Pawn and Dandy, it just smashed Bjergsen initially. Bjergsen had no idea how to deal with it.
Okay. Yeah, and you said this in a Reddit comment, I remember, that he didn't understand why he was getting ganked, basically, right?
Yeah, and then me and Bjergsen watch Dandy and Pawn play a lot and how they control wave, and it had a lot to do with what they do on their second and third wave and how Pawn pulled and pushed the wave and how it allowed perfect gank pattern for Dandy, and then we didn't get hit by that again, and we started using that in NA. So Bjergsen and Thorin started killing a lot of people pre-6 because of that and getting a lot of early ganks off, and then as TSM did that, other teams picked up on it, and now that's a concept that only top tier Korean teams used to be able to master and abuse to top tier Western teams, to the top tier Western teams going back to their regions, and then it trickling down to the top tier NA teams, or like the mid tier NA teams. So that's like a concept that.
So what is the concept exactly? It's wave manipulation to set up ganks.
Very specific wave manipulation in the first few waves to set up ganks. Yeah, it's just not letting the wave crash, and because. Back then, people played to push the wave a lot, and they just wanted to push wave and have priority and be able to roam and stuff. But now people started doing things differently in that season.
Okay, so that's one thing that Westerners have caught up in.
But I could sit here and discuss multiple concepts. This concept because of this concept because of this. Okay. But there's definitely concepts that the Western teams are picking up every time they go to scrim Koreans and they return. And they feed it back to the Western teams that stayed. And also the imports, they come over and they smash. And the NA, EU, China, they're forced to adapt and learn those concepts, or they're just going to get smashed. So specifically for this year, because of Rainover directly accelerated Dardoch's growth more so than any other player. Getting smashed by Rainover and learning his pathing, why he does his certain pathings, and talking to him, definitely helped Dardoch so much, and it taught him so much new concepts about the jungle. And then Dardoch using those concepts on other players also taught them about those concepts. And then now everyone has specific jungle pathing that they learn from Rainover or watch Rainover adapt or had it done to them, and they're learning. And concepts like that are just getting trickled down more and more so to the NA teams. Okay,
so I understand the concept. Clearly, there are areas in which the West has improved. Mm-hmm. So,
and the game's gotten simpler too. Without 2v1, the game got way simpler in terms of just playing the game out. It's so simple compared to what it was before. Pick draft got so much simpler. How you play early game got so much simpler, and Yeah, the game was way more complex with 2v1. And I think Cloud Templar and Kim Dong-jin both said removal of 2v1 was a nerf to the Korean teams.
Why do you think then, if the game got simpler, and specifically in this case, like we're talking about actually literally at Worlds because he couldn't do the lane swap basically, why do you think that the results weren't particularly better for the West?
Oof. For TSM, like I followed TSM really closely for Worlds and saw how they did. I think the RNG game, their draft was really, really bad. And the champion they put Hunter on, and then them early drafting Braum, and then finishing up with Lucian was definitely a mistake. I think like if they play that over and over again, like randomly, they don't learn after first game, and then they play again. Like that's a game TSM can definitely take. And then it came down to like a coin flip. Don't you think TSM had all the tools to make it out, and they just slipped up? Don't you think it wasn't like TSM had no chance in this group? And all the hype was garbage. I don't think the hype was garbage. I think what TSM came in with was very strong, and it was really unfortunate on Doublelift not playing some of the meta picks, and Doublelift being stubborn regarding Lucian, and Biofrost having nerves as a rookie, and Hunter playing Jace when he shouldn't have. But I think Bjerg and Sven played at a world-class level, and Doublelift has it in him to play at a world-class level, and so does Hunter and Bio. Like hopefully by next year, if they all stay together, I think they'll definitely be a force.
Okay, but here's a problem, okay? So in Season 4 Worlds, the number 3 seed from Korea was Najim White Shield. And you know what? Alliance won a game against them, was doing pretty well in the other game. Cloud9 won a game against them, then lost the tiebreaker. It was 1-1, then 2-1. Okay, these were like, you're getting wins off them. TSM is versus the 3rd Korean seed, goes 1-1, doesn't even get out the group.
I think it's so unfair to mark Samsung as the 3rd Korean seed, because
why is that then?
They are the 3rd Korean seed, but they really kicked it up during the gauntlets, and we really have to watch how Samsung's going to.
Yeah, so did Najim White Shield.
So don't you think, due to how the system works, sometimes the 3rd seed, especially the 2nd seed, who doesn't have to play to go in, they just go off of the points they accumulated. I usually think it goes 1-3-2 in terms of strength. The team that went because the gauntlet is usually the stronger team.
True,
I think it's been that way.
That happens in most seasons, because usually the team that goes second is the team that did really well in the spring and then just.
And they did okay in summer. So
yeah, because you automatically get the top seed for the winning summer. So the problem is you're skimming off. Yeah.
So Samsung was more like the 2nd seed in terms of strengths.
Okay. That's fine.
I think how TSM did versus Samsung was pretty admirable, and if they changed their draft for the final game, they definitely could have beaten RNG. And I mean, sometimes draft mistakes happen, so.
Yeah, but Loco, could have is wonderful, but they've had all this training. TSM has more advantages than any Western team in the history of this game compared to Koreans, and they couldn't get out.
Sometimes shit happens. I don't think like.
I don't mean couldn't like it's impossible. I mean they didn't. Rather, they didn't.
Okay, so I think in groups like TSM didn't go out, but that doesn't just smash the argument of the gap isn't closing because TSM didn't get out. It's not just here's results and here's the truth. You have to look at a lot of things that are happening in between and a lot of things that are changing.
So I'm just asking like what your reasons were for that. So that doesn't shake your
TSM
faith
underperformed. TSM underperformed. They had a misdraft on the final game. Like that's why they didn't make it out. Biofrost underperformed, Double underperformed, and they had a misdraft. So, what can I say? Like,
okay. So you want another piece of info that's kind of an interesting one I want to get your take on?
Sure.
So the gap has closed, yet the number 2 and number 3 Korean seed are playing in the final of Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? Never happened before in history, by the way. Just want to put that out there.
The summer split, like, I don't get why you put so much emphasis on the numbering of the seed, because this summer split was so weird. Like,
so wait a second. So Loco thinks that Samsung is better than ROX.
If I had to numerize them for coming into Worlds, it would probably be. Oh well.
In no universe would you have had Samsung above ROX, mate. I could go back and watch that episode that we did, the Worlds episode. There's no way you had Samsung above ROX. There's no way.
Yeah, you're probably right, but I mean, Samsung didn't play SKT, and they got a really easy group.
I agree.
How Riot did the bracket. So, like, the number 2 and 3 thing has more to do with Riot's bracket than like the actual strength of the team.
I agree. Yeah, that's true. I mean, put it this way, if you...
Why is that being brought up then?
I'm asking.
Why is that being brought up as like a fuel for your argument? It's just shutting on Riot's system.
Just asked you what the reason that you thought it was.
Okay.
These are all circumstantial pieces of evidence.
Okay.
I mean, for example, you talk about like laning mechanics have improved, blah blah blah, all the rest of it. Like
macro also improved, but macro is still the biggest gap, and macro and mid.
I think macro got worse, Loco.
Really?
I think that's where the gap widened. Like when I watch all these games, put it this way, here's what was great about H2K versus Samsung. I know lots of experts, Loco, who aren't idiots, you know. Like for example, I don't consider myself an expert, but I'm talking about people who watch all these LCK games. They watch all, like, you know, they have different regions. One watches NA, one watches EU, one watches China, whatever, right? They're not people who, like, haven't seen these teams play. And the reason why a lot of them thought that, like, H2K had a chance. Now, they didn't think H2K was going to win. No one actually believed that, Loco. But some of them thought, like, you know what, maybe they could get, like, 2 games or a game. And the reason why they thought that is because on paper, this argument that you're making now of, like, mechanics has gotten closer, like, macro's not as terrible as it used to be, this all seemed to suggest that, like, H2K should have a chance, actually. I mean, look at their players. They don't really have any bad players on that team, you know. They have some pretty good Western players.
They had one of the worst matchups versus a Korean team because they're a team with shitty macro, and all Korean teams have really, really good macro and really good rotation.
This is one of my points, Loco. So my point is they'd kind of made up almost all the other gaps you could make up, right? They had pretty good players, pretty solid laning. In fact, I'd even say I still think now some of the H2K players might be better than some of the Samsung players, because Samsung isn't a team, it's like an all-star team, you know. But here's the thing, in terms of macro and like understanding what to do at what point in the game, Samsung like destroyed them. It's no wonder that game wasn't close.
They dumpstered them.
And that game wasn't close, Loco, even with Jankos having almost like perfect like ganks and shit where he was just like, it wasn't even like he can't even have planned some of that shit. He just went better than, and it still was a stop, you know.
I mean, that's because the European mid shit the bed.
It's a Korean mid, mate, but okay. No, so come on. So what do you think about this? And why is the macro gap closed? Because that's the one I really disagree on. I think that's where I see no hope for the West.
The thing is, macro is one thing that stays relatively similar season by season, you know?
Okay.
Dragon is important. Taking early dragon is always important. You need to rotate this way. You need to manage your wave this way. This is how you split push. This is how you 1-3-1. This is how you 1-4. This is how you 3-1-1. All these concepts happened in previous season 3-4, and people are learning it. So if, like, back to the original point, if Korean macro mastery was like 7 out of 10, and then now it's like a 8.5 out of 10, like the West in terms of like actual gap closing, like they learned a lot of these concepts.
Okay.
Like we are fucking stupid. Like if we get shit on, if you get dumpstered on, we know why we got dumpstered on, and then we learn those macro concepts. It takes a lot longer to learn than it does for Koreans, but we're learning.
So wait a minute. You just said there, if we aren't dumb, if we get shit on, we learn from those macro concepts, and the idea is then they can add them to their game, the Western teams, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if that's true, then why aren't they catching up all the time? Why is it the same story every time?
Because Western players are really stubborn, and sometimes they, like, I know for a fact how well Tony, how well Reaper, how well Parth knows the game. Okay. When I talk to them, their game knowledge is up to par to Korean coaches. Like, I talk to Korean coaches, I talk to NA coaches.
Okay, for anyone who doesn't know, by the way, that's the CLG coach, Reaper, that's the C9 coach, and then EDG, was, you said, Path, TSM. Okay, the TSM coach. So the 3 NA coaches Loco's referencing. All right, keep going.
Yeah, and then I talk to people like Rapistar from EDG. I talk to Korean coaches. I talk to... And then the game knowledge gap isn't, like, there. Like, it's not that big. Like, they know the
with the coaches, yeah. But the question is with the players, Loco.
Now, once the structure is getting more set up and the stubborn players get weeded out more and more so, won't the coaching knowledge, like, trickle down to the players and the players actually start learning and respecting coaches more?
I mean, you're saying that, Loco, but if you ask me the question, I think not really. Because, I mean, I've watched the... Here's the thing, okay? Here's one of the worst things, I think, for suggesting that the gap gets smaller, is that when you said all that stuff, Loco, mechanics have gotten better, all the rest of it. Yeah, well, for a start off, Koreans have started going to those countries and qualifying on those teams, mate. So, I mean, that's a problem right there. Like, for example, remember your TSM team? I remember why they got a lot better. Yeah, you joined as a coach, but they also got Lost Boy, a fucking super veteran who has insane game knowledge and has been one of the best Korean teams his whole career. So, oh wow, the West has closed the gap. No, they haven't. They've just literally got someone to fucking boost them in the game.
When Lust leaves, doesn't that knowledge stay with TSM coaching staff, players that played with him?
I'd love to think it does, but then you watch some of the things in the game and
not completely.
Doesn't really look like it.
it doesn't like shift 100% over.
Sure.
But don't you think they definitely learn something from playing with Lust, talking to Lust, living with Lust?
Yeah, but here's the problem. They might level up, like in my analogy, you know. The problem is, to me, the Koreans just get better and better. And in fact, I even think this is the worst part. This is why, to me, the gap's opened. Is because before, I agree, SK Telecom or Samsung White or Samsung Blue, yeah, these teams were way ahead. The difference is, back then, you could get a win on a Samsung Ozone or a Najim White Shield. You know, the third sort of team, they're not as good. You might have a chance against them. The difference is now, what Samsung Galaxy is showing me now, is that even like, what on paper coming in as the worst Korean team is way ahead in these macro concepts, you know. So it's like the trickle down in Korea has been better.
It was versus H2K, the Western team that's famous for having bad macro.
Okay, but what I'm saying is the trickle down happens in Korea as well, you know.
It does, and
it's greater in Korea.
League is becoming more and more globalized. No,
sure.
People just watch Korean solo queue. I can't imagine people doing that 3 years ago, like just sitting down and loading up Korean solo queue and watching what people do. People watch LCK religiously. People make connections with Korean players and they talk to them. People have Korean players living with them and they talk to them. So the Korean knowledge is getting more and more spread out. And
here's
the
thing,
Korean
Loco.
structure is being more and more adopted, or even getting better in West.
Let me put it this way. I agree that, put it this way, okay, here's the difference, okay. If you had a quiz, right, imagine you could make some sort of standardized test for like knowing what to do in this situation in a league game, you know, like, look, in this situation, what do you think would be the best course of action? I actually think that a lot of the Western coaches, listen, they wouldn't get 100 out of 100, but let's say they do pretty well. Some of them would have like 90. You know, some of these guys really know their homework, know what the fuck they're doing. The problem is, I think the average Western player, it would be not very high at all, you know. Like some of them, like the odd one, okay, not the odd one, the fucking jungler. The odd one who's like an unusual case, maybe he's as high as a coach, like an intelligent player. But the problem is, you get those players who have the skills but they don't have a lot of brain. I think that guy wouldn't be super high up, whereas I think the average Korean level, because of how good their teaching system is, I think some of them just kind of by rote even would be better.
So, like, in terms of Korean culture, like, Korean culture really, really shifts on youngers talking back to elders and youngers not learning from elders. So, just by basis, Koreans are able to teach the knowledge they have a lot easier. And Korean teams with bad coaches will have bad macro. When I look at some of the decisions that C9 makes regarding what they do with Jensen and what they do with Meteos, I think it goes completely against what I know Reaper can do and what I know Reaper's knowledge is at.
Sure. You kind of agree with my point here on this run, right? This point about the fact that the trickle down isn't as much,
But more and more so, like now you have players like Smoothie who learned macro from both me and Reaper, and now he has great macro knowledge. His laning's getting better. There's players like this that are gonna start to slowly replace players on teams that are stubborn and that aren't willing to learn, or players that aren't willing to learn or that are stubborn are gonna start learning because they're like, holy shit, I really like playing League of Legends. Holy shit. With the possibility of franchising, the money becomes fucking huge. So I really want this, and like I really want to do this seriously. So I'm gonna start learning from coaches. And as owners empower coaches more, as coaches get better, as there's more structure, I think players that are stubborn, players that are like not as willing to learn, are slowly gonna change their mindset more and more so, and a lot faster than it's been like done in the last year.
Sure, because I mean, this is one of my problems, is that when I see some of the advancement in the West, I look, and some of those players are Korean. I mean, you mentioned Rainover there. Like, Rainover, before the lane swap essentially got destroyed, I thought Rainover was fucking amazing at knowing where to go on the map and like how to do the wave manipulation. It seemed like he was ahead of most people in the West, you know. People skill-wise might have been as good or better than him, sure, but... And the problem with that is he's Korean, Loco. You can't really give that to the West, can you, in that scenario?
I know, but Rainover single-handedly changed all junglers that are in NA and EU by forcing them to play against Rainover and teaching them how Koreans will abuse you when you get to the world stage. So they already had their booty spanked by Rainover in Europe, and then so they knew what to expect from Koreans, and they learned a lot of concepts. And the same thing happened in NA. TSM, Spencer says this all the time, Jarge says this all the time. They learned a lot from Rainover. Dardox has said all the time they learned a lot from Rainover. They learned by playing versus these players. These players going over not only like directly moves them to another region and powers up that region, them playing in that region also slowly powers up that region.
Sure.
Because you can't deny that.
Another area that but my whole point is like the best examples even in those regions are still Koreans. I'm not asking you to be as good as like fucking Peanut, but you better at least be getting to Rainover's level. Otherwise, how much is that gap closing?
I mean, they're slowly getting to there. Like, it's not like it's gonna happen instantly, but NA junglers and EU junglers definitely would be worse if Reignover and Huni stayed in Korea. They would not be at the level they are at now without Reignover and Huni.
I also
And
think, I mean, this is just my opinion, again, don't claim to be an expert, but just as an outsider reading interviews and looking at how the game's played, I even think that the reason why some Koreans who are good and then go to the West and they don't seem to be as good in the West is exactly because of this gap. Like, what happens is they play with their teammates and then they've quickly realised, oh, these guys don't see the game the same way as me, and in fact, I'm kind of fucked. Like, the worst example for me, Loco, is all those people who were shitting on Spirit when he was in Fnatic? When I look at Spirit in Fnatic, I see a guy who's literally like, these guys just aren't going to get it. So I'm just going to have to play the one style that I think can work and just pray it somehow works. Because, I mean, I don't think he wanted to just power farm all year long, mate. I don't think that would have been his ideal dream world. But he saw he had a top lane that was always a liability. Febiven's going to do whatever the fuck. Febiven, like, he had no options,
Okay, but back to like the original point. All the points I bring up, all the things I mentioned, stand for Koreans and the Western team. The gap slowly closing. No.
It stands for Westerners improving. Now, whether the gap closes, I don't know.
The thing is, when you're worse than someone, it's really hard to get better when there's no one above you. When there's no one above you to learn from, when there's no one above you to directly copy, it's really hard to improve. The rate that the Koreans are improving is slower than the rate that the Westerners aren't improving. Can you give me that?
Yeah. But mainly, I would say...
So the gap is closing. That literally means the gap is closing. If Westerners are improving faster than Koreans are improving, then the gap is definitely closing. And once the Koreans get like near mastery level, the Westerners now all they do is catch up to that near mastery level, and then Riot resets the season and it's a brand new game. It happens every year. They get closer, they get closer, they get closer, and then Riot resets the season, and then it's usually Korea and NA are pretty similar when the seasons get reset. And then once the meta becomes established, Koreans are far ahead, Westerns are behind, and then they start learning from Koreans.
So here's an interesting point.
That's like a common pattern every season.
Here's a really interesting point you've kind of made here. So what you're saying is the gap closes, and then it gets reset, but then in the time that the season happens, the gap opens again.
It opens again, but every year, because of the concept, like League of Legends, like even though the changes are huge that are being made, still remains like a same game, It's not like Season 3 League of Legends is completely different from Season 6. There's definitely a lot of different aspects and new concepts you have to learn, but all those concepts are carrying over. There's new concepts that you're going to have to learn, but there's also concepts that carried over during that reset. It's not like it gets completely reset.
Sure. But here's an issue I have then. If the game didn't change, so there have been esports games in the past. Brood War's a good example. It didn't change for like 10 years.
Brood War, Smash, yeah.
If it just doesn't change, I actually think that the gap would have closed a lot more. Like now I think it'd be pretty reasonable because you could literally learn something. And then the idea is you never have to like learn a different version of that. Like that's in your brain and then you keep going. Okay. The problem I see is that when you have all these changes, one of the main things that I would count as a skill of Koreans is they seem to adapt better to changes. So, for example, famously, this is the reason why people often cite, I think it's got a good point to it, as to why Samsung Blue was so amazing. Like, they basically figured out the meta before everyone else, right?
Yeah, I mean, they adapt faster, but it's not like the patch hits and then you play right away. Riot's moving more and more away from that, where the patch hits and people have time to adapt and change.
Sure.
Oh, also, one more thing. Oh, fuck, what was I going to say? When the meta stays stale, people definitely do. The gap closes a lot more. So when the meta was Rek'Sai Gragas for like 2 to 3 months, like that was ridiculous. All the junglers I thought were playing at a top tier level, because when they got Rek'Sai and Gragas, both of them knew how to play that matchup exactly, and people weren't wasting bans on junglers as much. So Rek'Sai Gragas meta I thought was figured out really well all across the world. So, like, if the meta really did stay the same for a long ass time, like, the gap would definitely close a lot more. Like, go back and watch the Gragas Rek'Sai era and see, like, how good every jungler was in terms of their pathing. There was no one getting fucked in jungle. Everyone was getting the right amount of farm. They were looking for the right kind of ganks because the meta was just so figured out.
So another problem, alluding to what you mentioned before about like the knowledge trickling down and, for example, Koreans going to other regions. So one issue I have is this, which is, in the past, it actually always disappointed me when EDG used to go to Worlds, and they used to dominate their region, and then they'd go to fucking Worlds, and then they'd never do super well, right? They'd never be like what a number one Korean seed should be, which is like a potential champion who could win the whole tournament. So the problem is, this season, Loco, they had a Korean. They had a Korean who's been there from the beginning, from day one. And I've no doubt he was doing his job in Korea, in China, coaching these guys, giving them concepts. Yet they come to Worlds and they're even worse than they are in China.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I mean, it was really, really unlucky for them in terms of Clear Love's style worked out really well towards the patch right before.
Okay.
And then I don't know like what the hell was going on with their top situation. Their top situation was like, what the fuck? It wasn't a very top-based meta, but their top laner was probably like the 15th or the 14th worst top in the game, at Worlds. So I honestly cannot say I watched a lot of China and I know exactly what happened to EDG, but I understood the hype behind them. But when I looked at them and then like I opened it up, it was like, okay, Clear Love's really passive. They constantly switch out mid. I mean, Scout and Pond played decently.
Yeah.
Their bot lane was so hyped, but was not as good as I thought they would be, and their top lane was just utter garbage. So they had they've been wrongly hyped because they smashed the finals.
But I mean, we've seen that in China, for example. The Korean coaches go to China and they're actually less effective than they were in Korea. I mean, for example, I think the Starhorn Royal Club one was a Korean.
Because the players won't listen. It's how are you going to be effective? The players won't listen. Here's the thing. If a Korean team has bad macro, if a Korean team has bad draft, I can 100% say it's the coach's fault. I can be like, okay, their coach is garbage.
Okay.
He drafted like shit. He doesn't know how to teach macro. He's a bad coach. If a Western team has bad macro or Western team has bad draft, I don't immediately go to, oh damn, that coach is garbage.
Because you think the players might not listen?
Yeah, because the players might not listen.
I mean, I'll give you an example of one right now where this must fit your example. So Reaperd, I'm sure you have a lot of respect for him as the coach of Cloud9. But you look at Cloud9 versus Samsung, and it's almost like these players are trying to lose the game. They're like drafting losing lanes and shit.
I'm sure he had limitations, and if you watch what he says in interviews, he's like, they're like wild stallions that I must carefully guide. Do you think Korean coaches would ever say that? My players are like wild stallions that I must carefully guide.
Probably not.
Because they'll just listen. They're not like wild stallions. They're more like sheep that will listen to what you tell them to do. And the knowledge gets directly transferred over, and then they'll do it in game. And if it doesn't work out, the coach can be like, oh, my knowledge was shit, or I was wrong about this because it didn't work out.
So here's a problem, Loco, right? Macro is a very difficult topic, not just because of the principles, but because obviously it's like doing an experiment where the variables change every single time almost. You know, like sure, there'll be a general pattern, but part of the reason why I understand why it's hard for Westerners is because in that situation, there's like 50 things you have to think about, and then you have to narrow it down to which decision do I have to make here. So it's very hard, okay? But one thing that isn't as complicated as that, Loco, is the draft. So in theory, if people study all the LCK drafts and they understand the principles behind them, okay, I understand, Loco, once everyone's on the Rift, now you might lose because of mechanics. Now you might lose because of laning. Now you might lose because
why are you losing in draft?
Yeah.
Because players and coaches might disagree, and players might get their way over the coaches. Or players might be very, very hesitant to play a certain style coach tells them to in practice, and they don't practice that, even though that's the best style, so the coach can't pull it on stage.
But wouldn't that literally be the easiest thing to close the gap on, is the pick ban, right?
I mean, it is easy if, like, I don't think pick and ban is that complex, to be honest. Like, you can do iterations of pick and bans, and the way that people do pick and ban systems nowadays are pretty complete. And I think most teams come prepped for the situation. And they know. They know what that is.
But I reckon you would agree, right? You look at the top Korean teams and they're still winning pick ban.
It's hard because the players don't listen sometimes, and it's hard because you have limitations that the other team doesn't.
Put it this way, I would agree with you on that point, Loco. I mean, I'm agreeing because I also think that's why there's a gap, is even on pick ban. So before we even got in the server, there's a fucking gap. So here's one of the problems, Loco. I know that what you're saying is correct. Like, for example, you know this story that came out? A lot of people didn't know it till the interview. That it turns out, you know, right? Okay, if it was a movie, right? Bengi had the best storyline ever in that semi-final.
Oh yeah, Bengi clutched so hard.
No, but here's the storyline. In the movie, what everyone in the West thought was, wow, what a god. He has secretly practiced this Nidalee pick. He must have a Smurf somewhere. He's never played it competitively. And what he knew was, one day I'll need... Right, that's a sick storyline. You know the problem with the storyline, Loco? It's totally false. I mean, Bengi himself said in an interview... Like, no, actually what happened was it was an accident. Coma didn't notice, and then Nidalee was up and we'd done our bans already. So he literally just said, like, we can't give up Nidalee. Can you play it? And he just had to play it. And he himself didn't know he'd have a good game on it. Now, the point I'm making here is That situation would never in a million years happen on the end part. Like, even if the coach said that, I've left it up now, the Western player would be like, I can't play it. I'm not going to play it. Like, I'm not going to look like a fool on the world stage and in a big match. There's no way the Western player would play it, right?
Probably not. It depends on the player.
Never played a competitive game on the champ. There's no way they'd play it like that, Loco. Come on.
We had weird. I guess we had like reverse situations where we had a champion that we didn't practice that much, and the player really wanted to play it. So I mean, it got played. So yeah, I mean, probably it won't happen, but I don't think it's out of discussion.
No, but I mean, that's an extreme example of the fact that essentially what we're agreeing on is sometimes the coach does know, even the Western coach in Pickban, what probably you should do here to get the advantage. His problem is, and I've seen this a lot, is that the Western player isn't open enough. Like, if he says, please pick this now, the Western player's like, no, I want to do something else. And immediately, it's literally the coach versus his own player at that point in time, not even versus the fucking
sometimes.
opposing coach. Okay.
And so, a skill that's really, really heavily asked for in Western teams, and this is actually why I'm a pretty bad coach for Western teams, is being able to work with troublesome players and being able to coax them into your ideas and being able to fight the right battles. I do think it's a skill that I need to learn if I do continue coaching or whatever, and just in life. But in Korea, like, that's not a skill you need to learn as a coach. They just listen to you, like, in West. So I think that's why I really respect Reaper, Parse, and Tony. Is Tony's so good at this. Tony's somehow able to gather all his troops and then have them play his game plan and like just do things together. Like when everyone's just like shitting on CLG and they're like looked as underdogs, like Tony is somehow able to like just like make them drink the Kool-Aid and like just follow under him. And like you need that kind of skill to be a really great coach in NA teams. And I think it's kind of ridiculous, to be honest.
Because I've got another area which is it's in the same category as macro, Loco, and this is an area where I don't think Westerners have caught up at all. So the area is preparing for a best of 5 series. I think Koreans have only just gotten even better at that, Loco. Like, that's one area where, here's the difference. In the SKT era, the season 3, actually this area, the gap wasn't as huge because people didn't prep the same way,
I can actually explain this really simply.
Come on.
So in a best of 5 situation, you have to be like, okay, if this doesn't work out, then we're going to go to this plan. If this works out, then we're going to go to this plan. If they pull out this, so we're going to need to float a ban for this. Like, you have all these different concepts.
Sure.
And your players might not agree with you. They're like, no, this is going to work 100%. We don't need to plan for that shit. Or like, no, we're not going to play this. This is such a low chance of happening, so we're not going to try this. And also, like, for NA teams, like, it does make sense. Like, I don't completely disagree with majority of players that say that, because the mastery on the game is definitely lower. So sometimes we're at the phase where mastering basics, and the Korean teams are at the phase where they're mastering variations. But once the structure changes and a lot of the basics catch up, that'll change also. That's just going to go hand in hand. I don't think that's like a specific area that needs to be targeted.
Like, I mean, along the lines of what you're saying here, I think the best chance for any Western team in a best of 5 against Korean is game 1. It has to be game 1, because after that, the difference is the Koreans always adapt accordingly as the series goes on. The Westerners just start to fall apart more and more and more,
True. So at the moment, like, I don't disagree.
I mean, that's an area where, unfortunately, again, you can even have Korean coaches, but if the players aren't open to it, I don't know how you close that gap,
I mean, it's because there's so few good NA players, so they can get away with a lot of things because there's no replacements. In Korea, there's like, I mean, you saw it happen where 20 of the best Korean players left, and people stepped up to like fucking man the harpoons. Like, what the hell? Like, where the hell did you come from? Cube looks like the best top laner in the world. Did you know where Cube was a year ago? Crown looks like the second best mid laner in the world. Did you know where Crown was a year ago? Like, these players were like nobodies a year ago, and then like they fucking manned the harpoons. Like, once the better players left, then they stepped up. So, what Riot's doing with NA, what was it, the solo ground or something? They're enabling, and then teams are having more and more subs, and teams are finding value in NA players.
Oh, where they're going to do that draft for the top solo queue players or something, right? Yeah.
So solo queue is being taken more seriously. I mean, solo queue last month was really competitive from what I heard, because the world players were there, and everyone was playing for challenger jackets. First world players, second challenger jacket, third solo queue training ground. So because of those 3 things, NA solo queue was really good in the last few months from what I heard.
Okay. Because another area of this, right, that this is an area, Loco, where when I explain it, it's such a simple concept that it just shows me that Westerners are so behind on so many other things, they haven't even got to this on the checklist. So in a best of 5 series, I have seen many Korean teams who the game plan they have for game 1 isn't their best game plan. What they do on the first or second game is they want to find out what can the Western team actually play. And as soon as they identify a key pick, like they can't play this, their whole pick ban changes around that, and they just start fucking the Western team on the pick ban. Whereas every Western team I've seen still thinks to themselves, let's just get our champions. Can we get our champions now? Like, that's like child's way of thinking, you know.
I'm pretty sure the Western coaches don't think that way, and it's due to players that happens.
Okay.
So, I mean, once the mindset changes, once the structure changes, and people catch up, I think it will be different. So, like, all these stuff you're mentioning will change along with structure and along with player mindset, which will come in time.
Okay. So here's a point I want to make, right? I think it's a good point, right? Regardless of whether it means the gap's closing, but I think it's a good circumstantial one. Okay. So one of the problems I think in the West is that people only compared themselves to the Koreans, and I always used to say during the first few seasons, you know, season 3, season 4, no, it's not just Koreans are ahead. Korea and China is ahead of the West. And so here's the key detail: the gap between both of them was big between the West. The difference is now, the gap between China and the West is almost non-existent. Now that's closed up like a motherfucker. And it's now China and Korea that has a massive gap. So I think
Why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, some of the reasons you're citing here. Like, I think Koreans got ahead on macro and pick ban, all these aspects. So here's the thing. China never had a problem in terms of laning. They always had some super strong players. So they just don't have everything else. To me, China is like... I actually still think some of their players are better than the Western players, mate. It's just that they don't have any of the other things. Like their macro.
Who's a Chinese player that's better, other than Uz? Okay, so name the Chinese player that you think are better.
Well, I mean, the problem this season, in season 6, is like nearly all the top laning positions have just been taken up by Koreans. So I think that's unfair now. But in the past, I think there was a bunch of them, you know.
Okay.
Maybe. I mean, like I think Cool was better than a bunch of the Western mid laners.
Ooh, I disagree with you there, because in Season 3 and in Season 4, the European mid lane gap versus the rest of the world was actually a lot closer. And
yeah, that's Europe, not NA though, mate. NA mids weren't really doing a whole lot.
Okay, but comparing them to the West,
okay,
like doesn't Europe count? NA always had.
You do realise the most overpowered position from the West has always been European mid laner. It still is to this day. It's Bjergsen.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the only position the West's always had where they could at least compete and get pretty close.
Dude, I think at this point, Bjergsen has to be considered NA.
It's still the West. You're the one now making... Okay, it's still West, right?
Yeah.
In what way is he fucking NA, mate?
He lived in NA he played in NA longer than he has played in EU.
What's that got to do with him being NA, though?
I mean, at this point, isn't most of his knowledge and most of his growth being done from NA teams, playing against NA players?
I mean, the irony, of course, is he barely plays any NA players, because mid lane in NA is fucking Korea and Europe. You got to give me that one, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of true, right? So, better to stick with the West.
I don't think only Paul Welter is like the NA mid right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the fucking gap on mid lane in the West has opened between Koreans and NA.
It's been like 51 minutes. Have I changed your mind on that the Korean gap and the Western gap has been closing? Did I change your mind on anything?
Here's the thing. You make some points that I think are good. Like I do think in some areas it might be true, the macro one. The problem with the macro example, okay, which is why it's hard to gauge, is that I think macro is the worst area to have any gap in. As in, if you're even like 5% better than someone at macro, that might just mean you win every game if every game was a 40-minute game, you know. I mean, it sounds weird to say that, but if you did the maths on it, like it would happen, you know. You'd probably just win 3-0 still.
The team with the better macro will beat the team with the better laning.
So you know what I mean? The problem there is that's the really hard one to gauge just how close the gap is. I kind of could agree on that. Like, for example, that's one thing I'll give you a good point on, which is the problem is because the Korean macro is so good, again, they're going to look like they're just going to win every key game. But Western macro has improved a bit, I would say. I just don't think it's improved that much still. Like, I still did, like, a great example, okay, TSM, they were the hope of the West. Macro's probably their one weak spot, right?
I don't think so. I would consider individual laners more of a weak spot than macro. Their macro was pretty clean.
You think that macro was up there with the Korean teams?
I don't think it was up there, but I think there was a bigger gap in terms of laners than macro. I don't look at TSM and be like, oh, they're a team that's going to get smashed in macro. I would look at them and be like, oh, they might have problems in top and bottom versus Korean teams.
Okay. But the other issue is, Loco, even if some areas, I would maybe agree with you now, or you make a good point. The problem is a lot of different areas that we did list ended with you just going, yeah, but in the future though. Yeah, but when people start to listen, then it'll change. It's like, that's all if, you know.
I mean, things are being set up more and more so for what I said to happen. Like the structure and the scene is taking place. Like everything I said, I don't think you can disagree with regarding the structure, and player mindset slowly starting to change. Like, and once that like takes full effect, and once it's like once that takes full effect, it's gonna have a real difference. Right now, it doesn't, but sooner or later, it should.
Okay, when you say that though, like it's gonna sooner or later, etc. Like we are in season 6, Loco. Like, do I have to wait until season 12 before like the gap has closed?
Ooh, I mean, next season is definitely gonna be next season. There's so much money involved in league. Next season is definitely going to be a season of a lot of changes, season of owners not being okay with mediocrity. So, I mean, maybe we'll have a Western team, maybe we'll have an NA team in semis next season. Who knows? I don't think that's like a ridiculous thing to say that an NA team can make semis next season.
I mean, obviously not. H2K made it this season.
NA team, NA, not Europe.
No, that's what I mean. But if H2K can make it by getting like a mixture of a lucky draw and just having a good set of games against EG, then of course TSM could have done it if they'd been in a similar scenario, right?
I mean, to end my point, I think the gap has definitely closed in a lot of aspects, and the scene is set up for the gap to close even more.
Okay, here's my question then. So if the gap has closed, right, give me like a relative scale. Say Koreans are 100%. Okay, we'll do this with you. Koreans are 100%. What was the West in season 3?
West in season 3? Oh, if Korea was at 100, West was maybe at like a collectively, let's say 60 or 65.
Okay, and then in season 4?
In season 4, but that okay. So why that doesn't work is I don't think Koreans are at 100. Like Koreans are something at like a 90, and then they get close to perfection.
No, but
right?
we're just finding the gap between the two.
Okay.
You know, we're not saying that they're perfection.
So I mean,
so how did it close in season 4? Did it presumably it closed again, right?
Yeah, I mean then maybe 75 to 100.
Okay, and then last season, season 5. What do you think then?
Season 5, I think last season. Season 5, that was the
Fnatic or Origin.
That was a weird Worlds because I think Korean teams got weaker that Worlds. So I think Koreans lowered a bit, and then they're at like a 90, and the West like maintained a 75, or some of the teams improved to an 80.
Okay, and what are we this season, season 6?
This season, the Korean teams really turned it up. I think every Korean team is still weaker than season 4 and season 4, or season 3 and season 4 Korean teams, because like even if you look at the top 4 Korean teams, like a team like KT, outside of Score, I don't think anyone else is like super good. Even on SKT, they have weaknesses in Wolf and Duke. On Rocks, they have Kuro.
Wait a second. I'm going to do a sidebar here, Loco, because some of these names you're figuring out are triggering me. Because here's the problem: compared to Koreans, maybe, but like I'll give you a name right now. So you said on KT only really scores super good, right? Someday would destroy any Western top laner.
Maybe, but not the way. If he plays like the way he did in finals, he won't. But
yeah, because he won't be playing versus a Westerner like in the finals, mate. So you don't have to worry about that. He better laner, better champion pool, better team fighter.
But that wasn't a problem in season 3. All the players were good, and like all the players were top-notch players. Okay. But now Korean teams are getting away with not having top-notch players, so the teams are definitely weaker, right, relative to what they were before.
Listen, I agree on the general point, but some of these names are killing me though. Like I can't believe you said Duke there.
Duke's teleports were so bad in some of the
games.
I was
and here's
shocked.
What's great. Even though his teleports are bad, every series he ever plays against a Western team, he'll have 1-2 minimum games where he just takes over the whole game. Yeah. It's true, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the thing. I actually agree on this point, by the way. So here's an area where I would agree the gap is close to a degree. As in, and by the way, we're going to sound like elitists when we say this, but I think it's true. The gap should be even bigger because if all those players didn't leave to China, Korea, Europe, then the gap would be even more insane, right?
Yeah, if Korea kept all their players,
Yeah.
especially the Samsung players, it would be so different. And they also kept sister teams. League
Yeah.
would it would surmount to an unreachable gap.
Like, for example, we're not saying that that means every team from season 4, all those players will be good, but the whole point is, let's say Crown was sick now. Yeah, he'd have become sick, but he'd have gone through all those super porn, all those people who he'd have to wreck to get to this top status still, right? It would be even harder.
Also, like Reignover and Huni not going to the West would really slow down the growth of EU and NA.
And no Western coaches who are from Korea.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it would be like Korea would be more secluded. So, I mean, definitely, if there were no imports, then of course the Korean region would have gotten stronger while the other regions stagnated.
Okay, just as a final side topic, this isn't about the West now, but do you actually ever think China will close the gap with Korea?
It's sort of weird because I've been learning a bit about the Chinese scene and talking to Chinese players, Chinese coaches. They really, really value their players, and their players don't get let go. So sometimes it doesn't make for the best competitive growth. I don't know. To be honest, I don't understand Chinese culture and Chinese region enough to have like a definitive answer on it. But from what they've shown, and the resources they have the biggest player base, right?
Okay.
From what I understand, China has the biggest player base, so they should have the biggest solo queue talents to pull from.
Like, does it not worry you that China had just as many teams in the playoffs as the entire West combined, and it's one region against two?
It doesn't really worry me. Chinese teams weren't that great this year.
Yeah, they're still placed as well as pretty much all the Westerners except H2K.
Okay. I think one thing that Chinese teams had was they had better Korean imports than NA and EU teams.
True, I think we can agree on that one. But I think Deft Alone's better than pretty much any Western Korean.
Yeah, Defpon, Mata Looper, they had better imports than NA or EU teams. So yeah, sure, their Korean players were better, so they carried harder.
Okay,
can agree on that.
So is that a way that the gap closes more? The West now spends more money and they get whoever it might be, Smeb or something, instead of China getting him.
Yeah, that's a way the gap might close. The West spends more money on better Korean players.
Okay.
And then the trickle down happens, and also those players play on the team, strictly leveling them up.
Right, do you have a final statement at the end of this episode, Loco?
I mean, to majorly sum up my points, all the Korean imports and people respecting Korea more and learning from Korea more has definitely caught up the West in a lot of ways. And once structure and NA leagues become more important and player mindset changes more and more so, I do think NA has great coaches, and NA will close the gap extremely quickly. Once all those things work in combination, it'll be very quick in terms of NA catching up. It's gonna happen like a staircase effect where it looks like not much has happened, but a lot happens at once.